Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Catherine Val online. This is our second seminar, and you excited to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So before we begin, so the second seminar, we have Professor Saptarishi Bandopadhyay.
There you go.
There you go. See, practice.
Same with last time we did it.
Practiced.
Yeah, you nailed it.
And Saptarishi is going to be speaking on, are we living on the question, are we living in a global hinge moment, shift? But before we go there, and before I just tell you a little bit about Saptarishi, let me just begin with a land acknowledgement. And this is a hybrid event. So some people presumably are on different territories. So please make sure you take the time to give thanks and gratitude, respect for the land that you're on. Today, we're here at York University campus in Toronto, and York University is situated on the traditional territorial area, which is known as Takaranto. And we acknowledge its current treaty holders, which are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we also acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, which include the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, and of course the Métis. And this territory is subject to what is described as the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant. And in essence, it's an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region that we are in. So with that acknowledgement, I'd like to welcome Saptarishi again to the Institute. Saptarishi is a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School here at York. And I'll just tell you, just very quickly, Saptarishi, we have many PhD students here now today, and one online, who are our inaugural PhD cohort for the PhD in global health. They proved themselves last week to be a formidable group. I'm deeply intimidated, and you should be too. So, just so you know. But Saptarishi is a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, and he's also a fellow here at the Institute, and he's a senior fellow at the Melbourne University Law School. He has a PhD and a law degree from Harvard, and also, excuse me, a BA and a law degree from the New University, National University Juridical, National University Institute for Juridical Sciences, India, and a highly accomplished academic, multiple publications and grants. Most of his research interests focus on law, history, politics of disaster, international law, state formation, environmental law and politics, environmental conflict, humanitarianism, human displacement, and to some extent risk and copyright. His first book, published in 2022, in which he presented here at the Institute, his first book was titled, or is titled, All Is Well, Catastrophe and the Making of the Normal State. This was published, as I say, at Oxford University Press in 2022. And in the book, he offered a history of the mutually constitutive relationship between disaster and states during the 18th century. And he showed how there is an enduring influence of underlying narratives, instincts, techniques, and practices on global disaster management today that continuously reinforce and reconstitute states. The book is brilliant. And for those I know, that one or two people were here for that. And it is well worth a read. It's beautifully written, I will say, which is, as you know, for academics, not always a criteria that's met. But Saptarishi is a great writer. And the book flows. I mean, it's just so beautifully written. And I would strongly urge you to. We have a copy here. I have a couple of copies here. You're welcome to borrow it and read. So today, Saptarishi has taken on the onerous task of addressing the question: are we living in a global hinge moment? And this is really a question that is posed because there are so many major changes internationally and nationally, and so many forces and factors at play. It's often so easy to get lost in the details of a particular piece of information or a particular perspective. But to step back and to look at the big picture, or at least to begin to do that. I'm not going to challenge you with that, that task.
No.
But to at least begin, right? Is begin from where you are I think is the key. And I asked Saptarishi only a couple of weeks ago to do this, and I know he's working on a couple of books now that are highly relevant. And I asked him to do this in light of the research that he's doing around those two books. And the first of those two books examines the history of war, environmental degradation and disaster, and human displacement from 1860 up to the present. And this it's funded by multiple sources. We don't need to go into that. The second book project presents a legal and environmental history of the relationship between international environmentalism as a movement in the 60s and 70s and contemporary global crises of food insecurity and climate change and the tensions that exist there. So from that kind of research perspective and the kind of questions that are in your own mind, Saptarishi, Saptarishi has agreed to at least begin to try to answer this question from where he stands. So with that, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and people online. Hello, I'm Saptarishi. So this is a, so are we living in a global hinge moment? So when James asked me to talk about this, I was absolutely terrified because despite his descriptions of what I'm working on very little. I have a 10-week-old baby at home, so I'm working on absolutely nothing. I'm working on trying to get 2.5 hours of sleep and not pull off some kind of murder-suicide. That's what I work on most of the time. That's what I work on. So given those limitations, I have contingently agreed to speak about this, and that's how I'm here before you today. So I'm not going to try to answer the question, are we living in a global hinge moment, except to say that it depends. So what I want to talk, particularly because you're graduate students, what I want to talk about is how can we, what are some of the major ways in people are thinking about this question, and how should we respond to these dominant modes and methodological approaches towards a question like this, right? So a question like this is sort of impossible to answer to everyone's satisfaction, right? And it's even, if we were to try to answer to our own satisfaction, it would be very difficult. And the reason I know this is that over the last 2 years, my only other achievement other than having this second child is I've been reading a lot. I was on sabbatical and then parental leave, so I've been reading a lot about a lot of different things for these two projects that I'm trying to write. And, Camus was not wrong. To learn to read is to start becoming undone. The more you read, the more insane everything seems. And the more you feel like it's not really possible to answer questions like this. But that's not the case for everyone. Many people, particularly people, elites, policymakers, leaders, etc., have to take on that burden of trying to answer this kind of a question. Because whether or not you like their approaches, etc., they're the ones who are trying to chart a path forward in one direction or another. And it's perfectly fine to say you don't agree with the direction, which I will, but we can't deny that a path must be charted, right? So here's a way in which people are doing this. So I've been reading, one of the books I've been reading is Graham Swift's novel, Waterland, which I extremely highly recommend. So here, and the book is, it's a novel that talks about immediate experiences of a history teacher who's kind of devolving because his wife tried to steal a baby and then ran away. And then over the course of him devolving in class, he talks about history and he blends together his narrative with the historical narrative. So here's a little extract. Yes, the end of the world's on the cards again. It's an old feeling that everything might amount to nothing. So when we say, so what are we talking about? When we say, are we living in a global Hinge moment? When people try to grapple with a question like this, they use terms like this on the left. Converging, compound, multi, complex, interlocking, cascading, systemic, cross-cutting, interconnected, overlapping crises, right? So it's not one thing. If you're a super specialized expert in one thing, which has been the mode of academics and experts since the 19th century to be super specialized, this kind of a question says you're not helpful beyond a point, right? Because if there's 200 people in the room, there are 300 ideas. Now, these kinds of understandings, that to answer a question like that, you need to be able to talk about all the things that are overlapping, rubs up against this idea of systemic risks, catastrophic risk, and existential risks. Now, whereas these things talk about a multitude of things overlapping to cause chaos, systemic risks talk about risks within a system, within one particular system. And catastrophic risk and existential risk speak basically to risks that, if they came true, would lead to some kind of mass annihilation type event. So some large percentage of people or resources would be lost. So that's the difference between them. This identifies particular kinds of risks. This talks about how those risks would overlap and sort of procreate, as it were. So one term through all of this whole forest of terms, polycrisis is a term that's become increasingly really popular. It's become popular with particular, so it comes out of complexity philosophers it's Edgar Morin and Brigitte Kern. And it's been taken up by so this is what it basically says. The basic idea is that intrasystemic risks produce systemic risks. They grow and produce systemic risks, which then, when they reach the parameters and destabilize one system, they then flow into other connected systems. So I'll give you some examples. So polycrisis speaks to intersystemic risks that over time multiply in effect and are seen to synchronize in timing. So it feels like everything is happening all at once. So the way we experience the world on the news, it endorses that. And it says there's an explanation for why that's happening. But it's not a real explanation. It's a theoretical modeled explanation, because we're still trying to find causality as to why these things are overlapping. So the growing popularity of polycrisis just in the last 5-7 years is largely connected to international institutions like the UNDP and particularly the World Economic Forum, which in 2023, in its press release for its annual global risks report, warned that we're on the brink of a polycrisis, where existing risks and new risks may collectively evolve into a polycrisis. But again, they centered where are all these risks coming out of? They're all coming out of natural resource shortages. This is important to note for a particular reason that I'll get to in a minute. So the World Economic Forum says, what we're seeing now is a combination of old risks, which is housing shortage, inflation, social and geopolitical conflicts, and new risks, climate, AI, rise of tribalism, global debt, misinformation, etc. Now, this is not a new idea. It heralds back quite directly to the post-Cold War period, when suddenly, Soviet Union collapses, and particularly American international relations and the security establishment find they don't have new villains to fight. And they have an extraordinary budget. And so international relations and security scholars start to look for new threats in the world. And one of the threats they land on is environmental security. Starting from early in the Clinton years, and starting actually with Robert Kaplan's Coming Anarchy, an long essay published in the Atlantic magazine, there's this idea, particularly focused on Africa, that there is increasing development of environmental scarcity. Environmental scarcity causes hunger and deprivation, which causes social conflict, which leads to war and dramatic conflict, which threatens to overflow from the boundaries of small territories and effectively infect the Western world, the global order that's outside of Africa. Because at the time, most of these studies focus on Africa. And then it's taken up by Tad Homer-Dixon and Gunther Beckler, who's a Swiss scientist and a Canadian political scientist. And they produced these large multi-volume studies in the mid-1990s that try to ground and substantiate that something like this is actually happening. So what are examples of a polycrisis? So for this, I specifically looked at search ChatGPT for this. The reason I did this is because I wanted to see if there was a system that was accumulating in as large a way as possible all the stuff that's being written about this. What is the general summary? What's the general tendency? What's everyone writing? So the literature says this. So for instance, climate change, economic instability, and social inequality. What you'll notice here is that it ties the environment, climate, etc., weather events, to economic damage, scarcity, to migration, right? Which then causes or creates supply chain disruptions, food prices increase, reducing cohesion and productivity, and social unrest and political instability. So it starts with the environment and goes to scarcity and ends with social conflict. A second set of examples, COVID-19's supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tension. So again, a naturalized event, the spread of disease, leads to disruptions in socioeconomic systems, leads to resource scarcity, leads to conflict, leads to geopolitical tensions. Energy crisis, inflation, political unrest. Again, energy crisis, that is the management of a natural resource, is somehow thrown into crisis, which leads to higher costs, drives inflation. Inflation means people can't afford as much, people are disgruntled, social cohesion, distrust in institutions because they can't provide people with the resources, which leads to political instability. Food insecurity, climate refugees, resource scarcity. Again, food insecurity comes out of environmental and climatic events, leads to people having shortages, leads to people moving from one place to another. As they move from one place to another, or overpopulation happens, there are new excessive demands on local resources, leads to tension, leads to political instability. So across all of these, what you can see, that same post-Cold War model or Cold War era model of scarcity leading to social tension, leading to larger and larger expanding political and conflict and instability is being mapped out even now in 2024. Now, I'm getting these from ChatGPT today, but so what I want to focus on today is to look at a particular 2 articles that came out just this year. Tad Homer Dixon is one of the 2 main authors in the substantive article, which is listed below. And all of these, this idea, the same continuity that he wrote about in the 90s, he's now moved, and he and this particular group of scholars have now moved into the subset of talking about polycrisis. So they're seeing it as an extension of an old 90s argument. So their goal in this article, so they define polycrisis because they say it's been rightfully critiqued as being this empty buzzword, and that's completely appropriate. So they say we're going to try to give it some kind of definitional content. So the way they define it is the causal entanglement of crises in multiple global systems in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. It's still quite capacious, but it's something. And throughout the article, they say it's the starting point, etc. The goal of doing this is to try and say we want to rescue this from becoming a nonsense buzzword, and we want to give it some objective theoretical framework so that policymakers, when applying this, can't just use it for their own ideological agendas. So again, this is a bunch of social scientists, particularly international relations scholars and political scientists, who are quite science-minded and want to be seen as solving social and political problems through science. That's a big premium for them. And they want to make it objective. They want to make it objective because they think then it can't be abused. Right now, you can call anything an emergency or anything a polycrisis, and they want to say there can be some objective criteria. So this is their model very quickly. They say there are stresses, which are long-term processes. There are trigger events, say an earthquake or some kind of a flashpoint, and these 2 combine to create what they call a crisis. Now, and the 4B below says that in the ebb and flow of social and political change in society, the triggering event, the ball is the crisis of how society is overall. Now, this is a completely theoretical model. None of this actually means anything, right, beyond their description of it. So they're saying that each basin is a different level of crisis. And they're saying that when that ball gets pushed out of a normal system or basis, then it gets pushed into, could potentially be pushed into a deeper basin. And that deeper basin might be worse than what you had before. It could potentially be better. So for instance, here, they say, ideally a crisis in a system enters a basin that reinforces a beneficial system of behaviors and things get better. There's a crisis, but that crisis leads to some kind of innovation, etc., and things get better. But it could also enter a more harmful or undesirable but highly stable basin, right? So where things are really bad, but that system, that basin is quite stable, so it lasts for a long time, right? So we say civil wars tend not to end. Civil war is a deep basin, but it tends to perpetuate. That would be one of their examples. Now, interestingly, they say, for example, systems such as slavery and imperialism caused immense suffering over long periods of time, not as crises, but due to their lamentable stability and resilience. Now, a theoretical point here is that ideas of stability and resilience also come out of environmental security literature. So resilience in particular comes out of the work of systems ecologist Crawford Holling in the 1970s, who tried to model social systems on resilience in natural and biological organisms, where he said there are no natural limits. People can, and systems, even social systems, can continue to adapt just like animals and biological organisms do. So many systemic risks are endemic to globalization, they say, that can be managed by reforming the current neoliberal economic order, but never quite be done away with. You can never get rid of these risks, but they can be managed. So drawing on this, they offer some policy lessons. First, policymakers, that's really who this is targeted at. Governments, policymakers, fancy people in Davos, people who go to World Economic Forum, etc., not you and me, unless you go to World Economic Forum. I don't want to judge or presume. So focus on crisis interactions, not isolated crises. That is, you're trying to see overlaps. You're trying to see how does one spill into another. So look at interactions, not individual crises, which is good advice. And it's advice that's offered in many different fields, including disaster studies, an area in which I work. Address system architecture, not just events. So don't just focus on the bad thing that's happening. Look at the structural influences in the infrastructure that facilitated that thing happening. As in, no crisis happens in a vacuum. Again, solid advice. Exploit high-level intervention points. So they say polycrises speak of systems that are prone to non-linearities. That is, not one thing leads to another, but one thing leads to a sudden drop. So highly flexible systems. But in these kinds of systems, even a small amount of positive action can lead to greater outcomes because the system is flexible in their theoretical mapping. Okay, so that's what they've argued. So what are the examples and assumptions? This is where there are benefits to this kind of analysis. This is the part of the presentation where I turn on them. It's not pleasant. I suddenly reveal myself as not a friend of these fancy people. Okay, so examples and assumptions. So in the current geopolitical crisis, the former weak consensus of, these are all quotes, and I'm quoting them so you can see what they have to say. So it's not my paraphrasing. Including the prohibition of international aggression, nuclear taboo, etc. All of the stuff that was normal before has broken down. Because it's broken down, they argue we're shifting out of a normal basin into a deeper basin. Major powers now pursue conflicting visions of world order in an era of great technological, ecological, and social transformation. So my question is, when has this not been true? Right? And to be fair, you might say climate change changes everything, but it doesn't change everything. And if you're saying it changes everything, who does it change everything for? People that we're addressing in terms of the worst affected by climate change have been affected by climatic events for long periods of time. So when people study, when anthropologists study adaptation in primitive systems, this is exactly what they're looking at. It's how do these communities travel over time? How do they continue to perpetuate? So the general point, this is a very enormous statement to make that doesn't really have much historical grounding. In fact, historians who critique polycrisis have always said, what are you talking about? This is just history happening. Now, you might say there's no, but they're after causality. So they won't accept, and that's a good idea. It's not to say, it's a kind of dismissive thing to say it's just history happening, because that makes it sound like history has its own wheels and mechanisms. So they're going a step beyond that and saying, okay, but what are the laws? What are the mechanisms by which history happens? Which is a good idea. But the statement on its own is quite vague and is subject to being challenged through historical empirical analysis quite strongly. So examples and assumptions too. They pick Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's regional assertiveness represent in our framework a profound systemic crisis. The geopolitical system is out of equilibrium. Okay, so first question, the choice of antagonists, Russia and China. China hasn't done anything. It's just being regionally assertive because apparently no one's done that before. This again speaks to a Western bias and a particular Cold War era kind of thinking that speaks to the threat that is China, much older than the Cold War, the threat of China, and specifically Cold War era threat that is Russia, or Russia now. So, and it implies that the system that existed before this reflected a normal equilibrium. Who was it normal for? Who was okay with this balance of power where apparently, some political authorities in the world got to control the larger global system and the global order? Who is comfortable with that? So, what they're saying may factually be true. We are moving into a new era, but that on its own doesn't say anything. Who is to say that China's assertiveness does not lead to better outcomes? But they should, as a scientific analysis, be normatively neutral about that, but they're not, based on what their examples are. So, the situation in the Middle East is completely left out of their analysis. Is that because it's historical and continuous and that is not changing, or because it's somehow seen as normal? We don't know. But it's worth noting what's included and what's excluded. So examples and assumptions 3. Our model helps to distinguish between harms that arise from the normal functioning of a system and those that arise from the disruption of normal system functioning. That's fair enough. Some harms are internal to a system. Some harms happen when the system collapses and something else takes its place. Could be better, could be worse. But everything causes harm, so fair enough. Here are the examples. 19th century imperialism generated immense harms, but through the regular functioning of European-dominated geopolitical economic systems. Okay? So consider the amoral, normal phrasing of this. Sure, they caused harm, but it's harm within the system. They're trying to say we can't care about that because we care about inter-system risks. But my second question is, was imperialism a single system? Did it ever end? If you ask scholars and people who they're apparently trying to help, most of those people would say, no, it didn't. So, historian Priya Satya writes, history is always a story of continuity and change, but no previous imperial formation, by which she's talking about 19th century imperialism, embraced all 4 features: material measures of progress, exclusive sovereignty, racial hierarchy, and homogenization. She's talking about 2 centuries ago, starting in the 18th century, which together radically distorted our relations to the Earth and one another, leading to our present planetary crisis. So not only is our present polycrisis, can it be traced far back in time, but the thing it's being traced back to was not a singular system. It was composed of many different ideas, competing ideas, working out both globally and locally. Examples and assumptions, part 4. World War II and struggles for national liberation created enormous harms, but these were also internal to those systems. Geopolitical economic systems transitioned to a new equilibrium. Independent states, Bretton Woods, informal imperialism, and generated its own harms, but as part of normal functioning. So think about how normal is being used here. We're saying that if there's a system in place and it's causing harms, that is somehow more acceptable than the harms might happen when that system falls apart. But that depends, it's conceptually loaded towards who controls that system and who experiences the harm and why that's normal to that system. So, do World War II and decolonization reflect a crisis within a single system? What's the difference from the point of view of civilian victims between normal harms and intersystemic harms? It doesn't speak to that at all. It can't. Because what it's trying to do is tell a global and historical story that really only reflects the interests and the abilities of leaders and political elites and people who, again, people who go to Davos. They're going to sit and buy polycrisis as a thing that they can solve at the largest level. And lastly, they talk about massive refugee flows fleeing out of war in Syria as a trigger for a systemic crisis in the human mobility system, by which they mean the refugee and displacement system. Underlying stresses, but it's just that this was a trigger, but there were underlying stresses. And this is a list of underlying stresses. Now, there isn't room in this analysis for identifying and studying in any specificity each of these background stressful conditions. So is the human mobility system a single system? Has anyone, no refugee scholar would argue it's a single system. No human displacement scholar, no internal displacement scholar would argue it's a single system. And of course, if you present this map, this chart of what's going on to elites and policymakers in Davos, how do you think they're likely to respond to this? The obvious thing they're going to do is lean into global securitization. They're not going to be more open to anything. They're going to be putting more and more money into Libya to keep people across the ocean. They're going to put more and more money into Italy and Spain, border states, to try and keep people out of the EU. It's going to lead to more conservative solutions. They add some disclaimers. To be fair, now these are accomplished, polished scholars, so they know where their weaknesses are. So they add some disclaimers, but they don't respond to them. These criticisms, etc., that they're pointing out, so they say, yet historians and social scientists make their credible distinctions, but they make credible distinctions with a lot more empirical, grounded narratives about particular locations. Even when people tell global histories, they're constantly being challenged on these same ground. The way out of that is to tell very detailed case studies as part of the longer history. So, another little quote. What people who are looking at these big questions at a global historical level don't like is reality. Because reality is extremely complicated, extremely messy, extremely hard to explain through causal mechanisms. But that's what they want to do, and that's where they think the solutions lie. So some methodological problems with this approach. Overemphasis on system and structure. If you study everything at the system and structural level, you can't care about human agency. You can't care about complex messiness at the local level or the regional level, and how these, so the overlaps that you're studying are overlaps on flowcharts, not in actual people's lives and across regions. Abstraction and oversimplification. The only way to do this kind of work is to take messy problems and simplify them to the point where you can actually understand them and match them to causes. So, in fact, ironically, people who are complexity scholars are the biggest offenders of oversimplification, because that's the only way you can study it. Trouble defining systemic boundaries. What's the mobility system? Is World War II different? Is imperialism different systemically from World War II, different systemically from decolonization? No one who studies any of these fields would dare to make such a claim. And because whenever you make such an abstract claim about what is one system, you're leaving some people out, which means you're making a political choice to leave them out. So it's not a scientific choice. Vagueness and application issues. Models are too abstract and loaded with untenable assumptions, some of which I've tried to point out to you here. Assumes predictability. It assumes that reality owes you a nice, happy ending. It assumes that the complexity of the world has to have some kind of explanation. If that was really the case, we wouldn't need gods, etc. Right? Calculators would be enough. Overlooks power relations. Now, they talk about power relations, but when I say they talk about power relations, I mean they say there are, of course, power relations, because they don't have the time to go into the details and analyze power relations in one particular part, in some corner of a particular part of the world. So what they end up doing is reinforcing older ideas of what power relations are, what kinds of influence are obvious and visible. Too general. Because these models deal at such a level of generality, great, you've now explained all the world's problems to me on this flowchart. What should I do? Complexity overload. Even at that level of oversimplification, they're still talking about different historical times and scales, different geographical spaces, different systems that are constantly overlapping. It's a headache. The only way to get out of that headache is to oversimplify and then talk only within your community. And the only people you can sell this to is policymakers who want you to give them the legitimacy of scientific fact. So these are methodological problems, but there are also political problems underlying these methodologies. So search for causality, objective causality. They don't want things to be fuzzy, right? They want to give you clean, actionable intelligence, so to speak, right? But that assumes that there is an objective truth to any of these problems. as I've said, they can't be specifically historical or context bound or culturally descriptive, because that would create too much dissonance. You can't explain all the cultures that exist within Toronto in a map, on a map. Imagine trying to do that for the whole planet. Complex systems thinking and resilience thinking both come out of neoliberal thinking. So to expect these things to challenge a neoliberal global order is absurd. They come out of the work of scholars who were working in the 40s. No criticism of expertise and the biases of expertise and consumerist, by which I mean accumulation-focused capitalism. So many of these problems are tied to imperialism and capitalism, and yet this complexity thinking works within that. It tries to say the world is as is. How can we fix it? Without saying, why is the world as is? So it assumes normal rule and then says, how can we improve on it? No self-awareness of expert biases. These are mostly Western scholars who are mostly working on non-Western systems. But they're trying to say that there's a way to fix it and make it like the West, not realizing that there's, historically, wealth and power flowed west and south, and risks flowed east, and or west and north, and risks flowed west and south, east and south, for a reason. Neo-Malthusian, determinist, and realist assumptions. So these are all based on ideas of scarcity, overpopulation. Who do we imagine in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s was concerned with overpopulation and the fallout of overconsumption and scarcity? It was Western scholars, Western governments that were worried about the East and refugee flows to the West. That remains the binding underlying historical trajectory of this new model. Depoliticization of deeply political problems. In trying to create an abstract and create these models, they're trying to pretend that these aren't political problems that are caused by political histories. These are somehow can be treated neutrally, and as if they can be treated and modeled on maps, and that would somehow reflect reality. Ideal audience for this is people who want to act at the global level. It's not you and me, it's not marginalized people. They have no voice in this process. It's a world of experts. And therefore it's a rule from above, and it's completely anti-democratic. And finally, historically, they've been shown to have conservative and status quo affirming outcomes precisely for all of these reasons. So how do we study these hinge moments? Balance, so ideas, so how can you model, how can you study big problems while still not doing all of these things that I'm suggesting? Balance between your top-down overview arguments and detailed bottom-up empirical evidence based on case studies, based on detailed studying small things to try and abstract out rather than the other way around, where you abstract out and then try to offer evidence that supports that claim. Ground abstractions with granular stories that show continuity but also contingency. When do things not lead to conflict? It's not the case that that scarcity and overpopulation always leads to conflict. It doesn't. In most of this work in this literature, there's very little evidence of this. They offer you the few examples, but they don't tell you of all the times that doesn't happen. Define who you're trying to help. Why is that audience your audience? If you're trying to say you want to affect the lives of vulnerable people, then is it really natural that your audience should be policymakers and people who are giant funding institutions? When I apply for a grant, I'm constantly expected to show policy readiness, right? Last year, I read an article by a literary scholar who was looking at the history of disasters in literature. And one of the key policy advances that he offered in a little cute little box was that reading about literature makes us more humane. I was like, okay, yes, sure, you'll get the money. Yeah. So as graduate students, you're going to be trained in particular scientific and socioscientific methodologies that are cutting edge, that is off the moment. Try to temper that tendency and your reliance on that with a historical and culturally specific imagination. So don't imagine that the stuff you're being taught is a global and a historic universal idea of how to study people. It's not, or how to study problems. Mind the politics of you being experts. You working as experts, after you finish a PhD, will go into the world, people will treat you as people with PhDs, as having expertise. So understand that has enormous power. When you write something and you get invited to speak at Davos or whatever, wishing this for you, be aware of what that's doing. When you're invited to speak there, you're giving them legitimacy because they already have an agenda. They're calling you Because if you speak there, they can say so-and-so who's an expert in this field spoke at, and it gives them legitimacy. It doesn't just give you marketability and, highlights you in life. It also highlights them. Study how objective, problem-solving, data-driven narratives are always telling moral stories. Just because it comes out of data doesn't mean it's an objective story. All these scientific stories ultimately talk about who were the bad actors, who were the good actors, what really happened, and therefore what should happen. Anytime we say what should happen, we're telling a moral story. Even if we assume that when we're describing it, we're talking about real things in the world, they're still telling moral stories about what should happen. And that's important to realize, because otherwise you accept science as is. Commit to moral, ethical, and equitable narratives of your own. While you're critiquing the hidden moral underpinnings of scientific narratives, be clear in your writing about why you're doing this. Whether you put it down on paper or not, the person reading it should have some sense of who you are and what you care about, and you should have it. It makes life a lot easier when you're writing, thinking, this is what I want to advance in the world. Be skeptical of rushing to policy relevant analysis. The system in which you're being raised as academics requires you to do that. So you can write any old bullshit in your grant application, but don't bullshit yourself. Don't bullshit the ultimate audience for which you're going to write. Right? So think about what that really means to you when you translate that money into scholarship. And remember, rulers and policymakers are trying to rule. Remember the people they're trying to rule, which is you, your families, people you care about, people who are much worse off than you and me. We'll finally take a day off. World will probably, this is not a guarantee. This is just it'll be fine. So here, we end where we started. In particular, the last few lines, we see that there was an idea of the world ending, and that idea went away. And for a long time, there were revolutions and people committed to progress. But then slowly, that idea of the world ending came back, which should tell you something, is that the idea of the world ending, the representation of world ending, is not the same as the world actually ending. In fact, it's an invention, which only goes to show that if the end of the world didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. So all of the things we're talking about, war, disaster, complexity, all of this stuff, whatever it is in the real world, that's not necessarily what we see. What we see are representations of it. And representations of it have always existed. And the mistake we usually make is try to take the representations and convince other people that they're reality. And there's a distinction between them. So, thank you very much.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to save all the praise for the end. Just going to go right to the last point that you made. Reality versus representation. If we take that sort of polarized argument, or that argument of dichotomy, to its logical extreme, there can be no valid representation of reality, and therefore all reality must inherently be mediated through the subjective. And there is no place or utility, no place, no meaning is probably the better word, no meaning to any kind of effort at representation of a phenomenon.
Right.
So that kind of kills science.
Right.
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 Right off the bat. Right. And it kills the whole Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment project. And it means then that we are entirely, I mean, I'm just being polemic, right? It means that we are entirely reliant on our intersubjective beingness, right? And that has multiple, well, even the effort to describe it is kind of objectification, kind of the feeling or the experience. But if we just go with me for a minute, it means that we have if we have no objectivity and we only have intersubjective meaning and intersubjectivity, that intersubjectivity across multitudes of peoples has multiple meanings, right? And Now that in and of itself, if you, I don't know if you do or don't, but if you follow Vedantic philosophy, okay, that's great. Here we are. Let's keep going, right? But if you don't follow Vedantic philosophy and you follow some other perspective, it leaves you with unanswered questions about the nature of being, the nature of being and the I don't want to say the purpose, but the meaning of being. Right? So I'm just being polemic in that, it's just to kind of push you a little bit.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what you mean.
No.
Right? I think what you're saying is that question the apparently objective representation that allegedly stands as a legitimate representation. Right? So that's what I think you're saying. So I'll ask you to reply to that. And then I'll also say, how do you know that your objective, apparent or alleged or claimed objective representation, in fact, is an objective representation? And so I loved your turning point where you turned into a pit bull. It was great. I've read that paper. I read it last year. I read a nerdy draft of it actually. Some like I think 2 years ago. And it's a good paper. I mean, academically, it's pretty solid. But it is full of holes. And you exposed it. So final question. How do we know what is a good tool? And how do we use it? Now, I know you emphasized participatory, sort of bottom-up, culturally placed perspective and recognizing your perspective, and then recognizing other perspectives. But with that, how do we know what to rely on and what to go forward with?
So you've understood what I was saying correctly. So I don't think that there is an absolute critique of objectivity, right? That leads to a different kind of amoral cultural relativism, which I'm not a fan of, and both because that's inaccurate and because it's not helpful. And at its worst, it's nihilistic, right? Because there's nowhere to go from that. So I agree completely. So my problem with the objectivity is just that it comes from a high place of high enlightenment driven science, and it speaks to people who don't have access to that, who can't make claims in that world of, like, most people in the world are not here, right? So they can't make claims. So that's to be skeptical of that highbrow analysis, but we can't do without it. We can't do without it at the same time. So it's not that I'm saying that we should rely or not try to make claims with some degree of objectivity. We should, and that's what they're trying to do. And that's why you're saying it's a solid paper, because they try to create a specific model that can be used across systems, across problems. So, and as academic work, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what you're supposed to do, is try to get as much rigor as you can between absolute relativism and some claim of completely inhuman, computerized, godlike omniscience, right? You're trying to thread between that massive needle. And everyone comes out somewhere differently, and then you criticize each other. And then people who are policymakers and people who are civil society actors or people try to put together intersubjectively, they try to think what appeals more to them, and therefore what they think should happen. The key thing here is that whichever end of the spectrum or whatever amount of data or accumulation of data you rely on, you're still trying to make a moral claim in the world. Objective claims are also moral claims, exactly. Right? So when we act as if objective claims have nothing to do with intersubjectivity or how you think you should live in the world or what tomorrow should be like, it's not democratic, it's in fact stultifying. it leads to people dissociating from politics. If all politics is driven by technocrats, why would people vote? We don't vote for technocrats, so why would we vote? Right? So it stultifies democratic culture and process. So absolutely right. So my response to that is that I agree with your polemical critique of it. That's not at all my point. I make that critique here because these scholars and their background for the last 20, 30 years has been to make really large claims of scientific objectivity. And I appreciate what they're doing. I just disagree with how far they're going with it. Yeah. And that's what we do as academics. We can agree with methods. We can agree with, I have no problems with their what they want to happen in the world. I might even agree with them. They want to end conflict, so do I, right? But it's a question of how far you follow other people and where you break off. So that's what I would say. And was there another question that I should have? Oh, and I should also say, you know, neo-Darwinians, neo-Marxists, always much worse than Darwin and Marx. They're worse in the sense that they simplify much more. So if you read Marx, he's much more complicated a thinker, especially early Marx compared to late Marx, where he becomes more dogmatic. Same is true in Darwin. So if you compare Darwin to, say, oh God, what's the anarchist? The mutual aid, Kropotkin. If you compare Darwin to Kropotkin, their theories of survival of the fittest and mutual aid are not that far apart in many ways. But neo-Darwinians break off completely. And then you have social Darwinians who break off even further because they try to apply biological systems to a social system. What I'm trying to say is that these scholars rely on, say, Edgar Morin's idea of polycrisis. But if you read Edgar Morin, he is much more open. He's much more open. He's much more pluralistic. One of the things he says is repeatedly that the difference between human beings and computers is that human beings know how to live with uncertainty and ambivalence. Computers can't. The computers can't deal with fuzziness. And yet people who followed in complexity crisis are trying to become more computer-like. They're trying to make it automated. They're trying to talk. But Edgar Morin himself doesn't say that. His idea of complexity thinking or polycrisis comes out of complexity thinking, where he basically says that we should stop pretending the world is simple. We have to live in it as if it's complicated and try to grasp it at the level of complication as far as we can and constantly push that. But what these scholars and people in this genre often try to do, and this includes scholars of risk and precaution, scholars of risk and cost-benefit analysis, etc., they say it's all really complicated, but we have to govern. And in trying to govern, they're forced to simplify. Right? So they have this idea that they're dealing with the most complicated problems, but their solutions end up being conservative and simplistic because they don't actually want to deal with messiness. It's really hard to govern messy. It's really hard to be fair to everyone. So government—
But not impossible.
But the aspiration is that it's not impossible. But when you're the person trying to do the governance, you want to make it easy. You want to make it simple so you can explain and justify it to yourself. And there's always agendas, right? So it's not that, so I'm comfortable with it as some kind of a Buddhist. I'm more comfortable with ambivalence than many other people are. But human beings are inherently more comfortable than systems.
So
yeah,
we're going to go to two questions, but I'm just going to say, I love ambiguity. I love ambivalence. I love uncertainty. Because it's the place where you can be the most human.
You work with Doctors Without Borders. I don't think you guys are going around saying, here's the thing to do.
Yeah, no, not much of that. Okay, and then we'll go here. Go ahead.
I guess by way of comment, first thing I want to say is—
What's your name, sorry, sir?
Oh, sorry, my name is Michael.
Right.
That the polycrisis is just one of many concepts that try to well, quite practically just useless in trying to understand why we are where we are. The formula theory from an abstract picture is what it explains its uselessness. Behind every empirical evidence that is that is given to support it. Behind all of them, it's the smallest unit of measurement, you could say, and that is human beings. And it doesn't explain the inevitability of action that humans know basic spirit of freedom. And if you cannot explain this, then everything that humans do that you see becomes very impossible to describe because you don't understand the human spirit behind the action. You only see the outcome.
So two things, Michael. So first, I would go further to say there's no human spirit or human outside of the environment, right? So I would say, and even more, if you wanted to boil it down further, the unit is interaction between humans and their environment. So the creation of a society of people against some stuff that's not society. And the second thing I would say is that even if these kinds of theories can't explain that, does not make them useless. They are, in fact, and that's why I'm bothering to talk so much about polycrisis, is that it's not useless. It does enormous political work. It's very, very powerful in the world, right? There's much more likelihood that people who have power to govern and money are likely to listen to polycrisis and have historically listened to environmental security than they are to people who are to anthropologists who are doing deep work on why violence happens in particular communities, etc. So it does a lot of power. It's not useless. And it's important to not recognize that would be, for me, naive, right? You have to give it its due. You may disagree with it. You may think it's useless and that it doesn't help anyone. But just because it doesn't help anyone doesn't mean it doesn't do work in the world.
No,
right?
Not that it doesn't help, but that it doesn't account for the very basic, fundamental
Yeah.
Point,
right?
That requires more, what do you say, intense investigation, and that is the human being.
And that's a valid criticism.
Let's take Napoleon, for example. We can study Napoleon history for all we want and all he did and all the rest of it and the outcome of all of that. But we don't really know what's behind all of that. Right?
Right. And so keep in mind, there's an unknowability.
Why did Napoleon did what he did? What was it just Napoleon? Right? What about the other human beings that were part of this? Right? I mean, did he really say go kill and people went to go kill? What motivated those people to do? If we don't understand this, then the outcome is explaining the outcome is not doesn't give us any depth as to why things are happening the way they are.
In the past, Tad Homer Dixon and people in this field have focused a lot on the psychology of mass violence. So they tried to look at social psychologists who study violence. But when they first of all, social psychologists are not unanimously agreed on what constitutes mass violence, even how to define it to why it's caused.
Right.
So they abstract from that, and then their idea of violence has even less content. Right? So, but that's the nature of the further you get away from what's happening, the more you're having to assume, the more you're having to guess and tie things together. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do that. It just means that there will be a lot of gaps and holes. That's the nature of this kind of research. I've never understood why Napoleon just never swam off the island to escape exile. It's not that far.
Yeah.
Really not.
Because he was quite comfortable.
Yeah, probably.
And
Yeah.
his friends were coming back and forth.
There you go.
You know?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Rupsha. I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about, sort of like the echo chamber of people, writing these generalizations, making these sort of grand claims, and then being invited certain places to speak, policymakers. So it becomes like self-reinforcing of this like echo chamber of this is what I believe in, and this is you're supporting what I believe in, so I'm invited to talk. So I was just wondering like what your thoughts were of new ideas sort of infiltrating space.
And how new ideas infiltrate that space. So I think in large part, new ideas infiltrate the space by two ways. One is genealogy, which is words and terms over time interact with the world around them and take on different meanings. So the word crisis or disaster has taken on many different meanings. Even knowledge has taken on many different reasons. So one is that. historical process interacting with conceptual tools that facilitate or work against it. So there is a tension or facilitation. Another way is that is accident, is historical accident. So for instance, a lot of things had to come together in the post-Cold War period. A lot of things had to happen for the US military to suddenly become, and since the end of the Cold War, the US military has become the strongest champion of environmental sustainability. So the reason for this, in large, even though they conducted nuclear test silos, they bombed another country, they blew 2 atomic bombs, and then they studied intensely what the impact of that bomb was. They never studied intensely what happened to Native Americans who lived on the areas where they tested, but they studied intensely what happened to the Japanese because they wanted to prepare for what if it happens to them, right? So the idea here is that in that space where the Soviet Union fell away, the military didn't have a new villain to go after. They had a massive budget, which was cut by, I think, 37% or 40% in the years following the end of the Cold War. They had to justify the use for that money. So they invested greatly in studying the environment, and they became champions of global sustainability, but not necessarily to protect the planet. They wanted to promote global sustainability because they bought into ideas emerging at the time that if other people don't have good environments where they can live happily and they have resources, when they run out of resources, they'll come here, or they'll fight amongst themselves and that will implode. So environmental security becomes, after geopolitical security, environmental security becomes for the planet, becomes a threat. The planet as a threat has existed as an idea for much longer, but it suddenly comes to the fore at this point because other ideas have either become redundant or have, for some reason, become unfashionable. And then powerful actors need to justify their existence. And so then friendship, an affinity is created. So it's that's why, yeah.
Let me get you, go ahead. Yeah, let me just get you to comment on this. I'd love to hear your insights. What I'm hearing you say is you're not, by definition, endorsing or condemning the tool that the polycrisis framework represents.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying is understand where it comes from and understand how it is being used to perpetuate and to reinforce a system, a post-World War II system, not just post-Cold War, but a post-World War II system. Right. That is facing challenges. So that's what I'm hearing you say. And I'm also hearing you say, that's not an endorsement of the tool, nor is it an endorsement of the system, right? But at the same time, it's not a rejection of the tool, and it's not a rejection of the system. It's an illumination of the boundaries of this form of analysis and the boundaries of this system. And I let's get your reaction to that.
Yeah, so I mean, when I say thinking critically about very bad times, what I'm saying is how we determine something is very bad times, we have to think critically about. And there's lots of tools for studying whether or not it's very bad times, who it's for. And part of that is understanding that asking that question requires you to have some set of beliefs and a framework, right? And nothing is devoid of politics. Nothing is devoid of agenda. Nothing is devoid of history, right? And there's always some set of interests that are being included and excluded. So for us as academics, the goal is not, I'm not a willfully blind activist. That's not my agenda. As an academic, my commitment is to study with as much clarity and critical functioning as I can and say what I think about it. And that's really what's more important to me than solving a problem.
Thank you, Saptarishi, so much.
And then we'll go.
What's your name again? Sorry.
Imran.
Imran, yes, we met before.
Thank you so much for this critique. This concept is gaining momentum and it's finding its way into our language and we're using it regularly. So thank you for critiquing it and exposing the power relations behind it and why it's being used and how it's being used. And I think you've done a great job in demonstrating how it's a form of scientific legitimation of the preservation of the neoliberal Western authored global order. And the reason I think it's being advanced, particularly by the parties that you've pointed out, is to constrain our collective imagination about what are alternatives, right? If we live in a situation of crisis, we need something quick. These are the ready to at hand solutions. So let's use what we know, the conservative reinforcement that you described. And what it reminded me of, it's actually a very significant process, because when you think, and I'm glad you made the connection to imperialism, colonialism, the entire edifice of science, social science, and humanities during the colonial period was oriented towards giving the intellectual justification for colonialism. So the construction for instance, like the linear development of human societies, going from hunter-gatherers to settled societies, that was used to give a framework that would justify why Western colonialists had to go do to help lift people out of that situation. But that was a completely politically constructed paradigm to justify the colonial enterprise. And maybe in your reading list, you came across David Graeber's and David Wengrow's recent book, The Dawn of Everything. And they're anthropologists and archaeologists, and they've shown that the recent understanding from those two domains is that there's no linear theory for human development. People switched back and forth. They had political choices. And what has been it was an outcome of the colonial enterprise to constrain that imagination and reinforce in recent eras to eliminate the possibility of a new emergence here. So I think this is just really important to air this critique and push out against these constraints against our imagination. So thank you for bringing this forward.
Thank you. Yeah, so that is the goal. So I recently finished a chapter called Disaster and Development, where I trace the relationship between disaster and development from 1945 to the present. And what I try to show is just that, is that over time, both disaster and development have become things that are seen as evolutionary, that is, development is evolutionary, and what gets in the way of it is disaster. And that's an idea that's hardened. And therefore, the way to fix that is scientific innovation and technological advancement, right? But that represents a very narrow idea of why disasters happen, who they affect, who can change. And therefore, if you buy into that, the end point of that, as I show, is the 2022 or whatever, the global assessment report from the UN, which basically has moved from looking at where disaster emergency management begins is by looking at local context from the Red Cross, etc., to now it's moved to entirely talking in terms of systemic and catastrophic risk. When you talk at that level, you're looking at massive data sets and trying to see what might be correlations between past and present, etc. Okay, but what that does is now it's entirely understood in the context of climate change. The more you understand it in these massive data sets, you're trying to say, how has the climate changed? You're saying climate is the only reason why disasters happen, which means you're leaving out development. You're leaving out positive things, not just resource scarcity, but resource abundance. There's a whole literature in complex emergencies where resource abundance creates crisis, because environmental refugees or development refugees are completely left out of this kind of thinking, right? So things that we have called progress have historically had very similar consequences to things that we call scarcity. If we don't acknowledge that, then we're automatically saying that there is a trajectory of progress and this is the way forward. And then the majority of the world is perpetually supposed to play catch up. And that's just that continues to be an imperial way of understanding why people are, why societies are stuck where they are, and why they can't get out of their problems. Thank you.
Go ahead, Nil.
My name is Nilanjana.
We met last time.
Yes, and I'm the only one who can pronounce your last name really well, better than James. Because I'm Bengali as well. Yeah, it's my maternal surname.
Yep.
Anyway,
Okay.
So thank you for that presentation. Throughout the presentation, I was questioning if I should just get my PhD and start looking at something else, because I'm actually using resilience thinking. So what I'm trying to
Don't quit. Protest. Fight back. Don't quit. People start quitting. Who am I going to go to conferences with?
I'm trying to pull out, the idea about negative socio-ecological resilience from the anarchy model.
Okay.
And then bring in community resilience and see how these two could take it together to study transactional effects.
Okay.
in
Oh.
gendered natural resource economics in Malawi. So my question is,
Mhm.
this polycrisis methodological framework, what do you think about its applicability at a smaller scale?
Right.
Right. And if I am a researcher using it
Mhm.
when I'm still learning,
Mhm.
how can I use self-reflexivity
Mhm.
to use this methodological framework
Mhm.
in the right way, as you have explained? What are the steps? What are the best practices? I mean, I can definitely sort of, talk to you offline about it.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so the first question is scale, ability of this methodological
Mhm.
framework at a smaller scale. Second, if you're applying it at a smaller scale,
Mhm.
how do you use it
Mhm.
to sort of bring momentum to a cause that you believe in, like
Mhm.
at a larger scale,
Mhm.
right? And it almost feels like AI. It could be a good tool if, depending on who's using it.
Mhm.
And then the third one.
Unless AI is using it, in which case.
Right,
shit.
okay, maybe AI is a bad example. Yeah, so that's.
So, okay, thank you, Lanjar. So some of this might be helpful, and as in what I've tried to do when I've provided these lists, the problems, what I'm trying to say is don't do this stuff. This is what I think is a problem with this approach. So when you're using this approach, try not to use it in these ways, right? And understand that there's a politics underlying using the methodology. And so be aware of that and point that out and offer countervailing evidence to show that you're aware of what the tendencies are, right? And then this is a rough rule of thumb of things that you should keep in mind. Have some ethical commitments. Even if you're being scientific, be clear about the fact that you're trying to make an intervention in the world and you think the world should go in a particular way. So for instance, the authors of this article would likely say that they don't have a normative agenda. They're trying to solve a problem, but they don't have a normative agenda. I don't buy that. Everyone has a normative agenda. AI has a normative agenda, or will have a normative agenda, right? When it becomes, sure, yes. Terminator wants to, walk on skulls and stuff. That's a normative agenda. Like, I don't want to work on grass. I want to walk on skulls. It's more comfortable that way. But there isn't a normative agenda. So how do you do that? So first of all, in this paper, they're looking at global polycrisis. Polycrisis can be applied to a smaller scale. It can be applied to a national scale where different systems might be things like, what is the impact? So I had a student who wrote a paper about epidemics, so sexually transmitted diseases epidemics in Thailand, and its relationship with women who are no longer able to survive and sustain themselves in rural communities because men have gone away or the men are dead, and the farms are not succeeding anymore, so they have moved to the cities, and then they're enveloped in the sex trade. So there are different systems at work here. A collapse of a particular kind of life, or collapse of gender roles, leads to lots of opportunities, livelihood, etc. That leads them to migrate to urban spaces. In urban spaces, then there are different crises happening. The only jobs they can find in that society, which is culturally dominant in different ways, requires them to work in these industries. And she showed that looking at health laws in the Philippines, over time, the state has neglected public health responsibilities and in fact even encouraged sex tourism as a source of revenue. In doing so, it's created a tunnel, a pipeline from a rural crisis, bringing labor, sex labor, into the city where they no longer have health protections and are actually encouraged and incentivized financially to become sex workers, right? So this is and then what happens is you have this epidemic of STIs, right? So you have this larger crisis that is based on overlapping, underpinning crises, right? So that's an example of how you can use something like a polycrisis model, but not forgetting that the roots of that rural abandonment are imperial. The roots of the state's dissociation from public health is neoliberal, right? Because now it's all been privatized. So if you don't have insurance, you're out of luck. So how do you get insurance? You need money. How do you get money? If no other jobs are available, that's what you do. And especially the state is actively incentivizing that kind of tourism, right? So that's a small way of saying that it's possible to do that without ignoring history, without ignoring gender, without ignoring local culturally specific gender dynamics, how gender dynamics have changed over time, how history of imperialism interacts with rural agrarian life, interacts with urban mobility, interacts with what's available to you when you come to urban spaces, because urban spaces have a different politic. So you can do all of that work. And particularly if you're working in a small context, a smaller context like Malawi, not to say it's small, but it's more possible to tell a realistic story, a more objective story than at a global level. Right? So that's how you would do it. Carefully is what I mean. Right? And
Yeah, I'm going in the right direction.
You're definitely going, you're definitely on the right track. And the one thing that Nell's just finished her comp, she did a brilliant job. She's fantastic.
congratulations,
This is really, really fantastic. She's using system dynamics theory, complex adaptive systems theory to understand the phenomenon she's described. One of the criticisms that came out in the discussion as she was evolving her thinking was that there's a difference between understanding a system and its moral meaning. And but in order to change a system, you have to understand the system
and
how
engage with
it functions.
Yeah.
Right. So so we call this the boundary, remember the boundary issue, right? So this is, and you've got it up there somewhere, it's on one of your previous slides. But so I just would like to finish on a slightly positive note. This is very positive.
That's not my strong suit. So take over by all means. Yeah. Take over by all means.
This is very positive in the sense that this is truly, and this is why I'm so grateful you agreed to do it on such short notice. This is truly the best example that I have found. Saptarishi is the best example I found at York of a truly critical thinker, of a person who understands their role as an academic. It may not necessarily be to solve problems. It is to critique, right? And to understand the problem, to illuminate a problem, to be able to see the underbelly of what on the surface appears to be normal. Right? So thanks for that.
There's enormous downsides to it all, or I can talk to you offline.
It's
about
very
that.
depressing.
Yeah. Well, not just that. There's enormous downsides for grant getting, for rising in academia. You know, I will never be in charge of anything. No one's going to put me in charge of anything.
It's kind of a blessing.
But I want to be clear about what I try to do as an academic. And it's even if you don't say it, it's important to think it and be clear about who you are as an academic. Because otherwise, it's hard to know what your relationship with everything will always seem like, it's not enough. I can't actually fix anything. But you have to think about what you're trying to fix, what you're trying to affect. Right? So if 3 people read my book and come out thinking, well, this is all terrible, but I understand this better. So when I read the news, I don't have to just accept what's happening. That's enough for me to have a career doing that. It's not great money, but it's a great, you feel better. You feel better if you're like me. Yeah.
Yeah. And here's the final example. In order to understand, as I said earlier, in order to change the system, you have to understand it. And you talked just very briefly about where are the points of change in response to your question. And one of them was about, one of your answers was identifying points of tension. And I'll just give a very simple example. MSF some years ago launched a campaign, the Access to Essential Medicines campaign. Now, in order for that, that campaign has absolutely, by any measure, profoundly successful because it has driven down the price of medications, not just antiretrovirals, but of many medications. It has led to the creation of all kinds of new treatments for neglected tropical diseases and so on. Enormously successful by any metric, and one that has been able to do so by literally challenging the assumptions of a system that was not working, right? And actually finding the language and the understanding of a system that allowed you to challenge it publicly, and then also allowed you to create alternatives. So understanding the system is extremely important, and the framework here polycrisis, I think it's not a complete understanding, there's no question about it. But understanding it, how it's used, right, and understanding its intent is really critical. Being able to challenge and to be able to be in a position to create alternatives. And so for that, Saptarishi, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks very much.
You are welcome to stay.
What's
Because
happening now?
we're gonna have a further seminar discussion. We're gonna take a break, but we're gonna have a further seminar discussion as part of our PhD seminar series, and Rich is gonna do a presentation on global risk and where we're at, and then we're gonna have an ongoing discussion. You're very welcome to stay, and then you're gonna.
I'll try to stay for part of it. I might have to leave abruptly,
Yeah.
so please don't mind if I do.
Yeah, but you're very welcome. We know you have little ones at home, so.
That's a global
They
risk.
need their diapers changed.